You who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to bring the next instance of you who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to bring the next instance of you who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited. So, for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, for those of you who join us live, I am watching the comments to see if anybody has anything they want to say. Says it's not supported on private videos. Not quite sure what that means, but we'll go ahead and get started. So, last week, or not last week, but last time that we met, we talked about what's wrong. Like, why did Paul say, do not conform to the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind? And I believe that I may have mentioned, if not in a previous sermon, but also potentially here in this specific series, that the ways of this world is an important factor in this discussion. We're not going to necessarily get into it. But what we do have in front of us and what we do know is that we are the product of a neglect of needs that creates a fear and an entitlement and some other things, but also that we have in our very DNA a communication that we are limited to a certain way of doing things. And then, of course, unfortunately, when those needs are neglected, sometimes entitlements begin to play a role. All of our process is memory based, not imagination based. I want to talk a minute about what makes a human human. And the reason I do is because there is a tendency for people to believe that what makes a human human is that they're bipedal, that they have a higher functioning brain, that they are somehow superior in dexterity or whatever. That's what makes them human. The truth is, all of those things can be invariably found in various forms of nature. What cannot be found appear to be spiritual. Now, when we are talking about psychology, because invariably you would agree with me, one of the things that happens when we begin to discuss the mind is people start to think about the word psychology. They think about therapists and psychotherapy and, talking about your dreams and looking at ink blots and things like that. But the truth is that the word psychology itself comes from the Greek word psyche, which is the word for soul in the Bible. And then logia, which is basically the study of or the reading of. So psychology is technically, in ancient understanding, the reading of the soul. There is a tendency of human beings to move in a direction of believing that the soul is a separate part of our existence that does not necessarily play a role in our everyday lives, but only in very specific decisions. Most of you who are Christian actually began their journey as a Christian with a belief that they had a need for salvation from hell, and that when they got saved, they no longer had to worry about the process. When the truth is that the evolution, the spiritual evolution of an ego-driven psychology or an ego-driven soul is different as there is a progression. So let me explain to you what I mean. What I mean is that we actually have a we have a way in which we process information that is extremely spiritual. Now, the only reason I bring this up is, first of all, you got to understand that when we're dealing with the soul, we are dealing with something greater than the physiology of a human. Okay? Every single human has the same anatomical and also organ structure, and the brain is no exception. Now, there are obviously anomalies, and I can't just make that as a concrete statement. There is a tendency in the direction of believing that people who are smarter have bigger brains, but that's not true. Bottom line is that when we're dealing with humans, what makes you different from an animal, and give me a second with this, what makes you different from an animal is your higher brain activity, right? As opposed to superior knowledge or thinking, we have some what we call endowments or gifts, as it were, from the divine, or for those who believe more in an evolutionary side, developments of superiority that are more mind-based. However we go about getting to the point where we are now, those endowments actually form the core of the potential of a human. Let me explain to you what I mean. Generally speaking, if you take and run a predator into a herd of wild cattle, the wild cattle are going to stampede. And when they do, they actually do not differentiate depth perception, and they do not differentiate an understanding of where they're heading or what they're doing. It is just a self-preservation. If you really want to see an animal in action of their instincts, observe cattle stampeding, because they will run over each other. They will run off of cliffs. They will run into water. They will run into mud. They will run through barbed wire. They will run through a house, a barn, fences. That's self-preservation. It's a belief that you need to move away from danger. Now, in addition to that, we have the element of connectivity. Most mammals have a herd instinct. They feel that there are strengths in numbers, and they also feel like they are less vulnerable if they are in a position with others of equal position. And what I mean by that is that mammals have a tendency to be connected to a herd that also feels vulnerable, also needs that protection. They will stray away from herds that demonstrate superiority in some way. They will try to find an equality. The next thing, obviously, is reproduction. And if we need any explanation there, obviously, all we need to do is look to the animal kingdom as to whether or not there is a choice on the part of the female in that species as to who and what happens in the mating process. So those are instincts, right? That's just this built-in animal process. So just because we're bipedal, just because we have, opposing thumbs, just because we have, the ability to balance and walk and do all those things, but then also just because we have articulation and we were able to communicate with speech and all those things does not make you any less than an animal. So let's talk a minute about how the ego works. What is the ego and what is the process of the ego? The ego is designed to basically use those three instincts to make the best decisions because we have that superior brain to make the best decisions about those three elements: reproduction, herd instinct, and the preservation of life. And in the end, everything is geared toward the preservation of species, depending on how socially connected the individual is to reality. And what I mean by that is obviously there are those who would choose pleasure over preservation of the species. But the principle is that basically the ego usually is going to self-preserve, connect, and reproduce. Now, obviously, when we get into the intricacies and the details of decisions, that can vary from individual to individual, and that can vary from personality type to personality type. Whether you use the Myers-Briggs, or whether you use the Enneagram, or you use some other personality typology, there are types, and those types have a general connection to each other. There's a certain amount of types, and that's what each person is. In the sentiment of society, that is. Okay. So all of that to say that the ego is not the higher mind, and the ego is not the superior mind. The ego is a self-preservation process of self-protection, connectivity, and reproduction. And details of that get worked out from individual to individual. And the strength of the ego also. In the process of everything, we look at hungers, right? So we have hungers. We have a hunger for reproduction. We have a hunger for self-preservation. That's the consumption of food. That's the acquiring of clothing to warm and cover us to prevent exposure, right? And in that process, we also have social connectivity through positive interaction. Okay. All right. The reason this is so important is because one thing that animals do not have that is absolutely present in a human being is the I, the letter I, the letter after the letter H. I, as in me, as in self, a sentient self. We are aware. If you put a parakeet in front of a mirror and it's and it's and it's alone, it will communicate and try to talk to and maybe even feel threatened by and maybe even react to that parakeet in the mirror as if it was somebody else. And no matter how much you tell that parakeet that it is that parakeet, they can't tell. That's true of most animals. In fact, that was one of the things that they ran into, I believe, was it with Coco the gorilla? I can't remember. That might have been who it was. Is they could not convince that gorilla that it was an I, that it was a self, and it could not understand when signs were created to try to sign language was used to try to talk about self. It couldn't understand that. It understood you, and it understood he and she, and it understood they, but it did not understand I. Sentience is a human endowment. It's one of the things that separates us from the animal kingdom. Second is consciousness, an innate sense of right and wrong. This is where we start to get into the concept of empathy. This is where we start to get into the concept of law and order, of rule of order. And it's also where we get into the concept of chaos and anarchy. Why? Because in the principle of a sense of right and wrong, there is an establishment of mores, as it were, of common sense rules that govern a human's behavior beyond its instincts. So you don't just go mate with whoever you want to mate with. You don't force people to be in connection with you. You look out for others just as much as you look out for yourself, or so you would think. And then we have a third one, which is what? Which is willpower. Willpower is basically the ability to choose and set your mind on a direction and move in that direction regardless of instruction. So basically, you can choose to follow instruction. And of course, there's a symbiotic relationship between willpower and conscience. Because why? Because your conscience can tell you that you are being willful or moving away from the established rules of order. And finally, we have imagination, which is actually the reason why I have told you all this anyways. You know, I always tell the story, and you've probably heard it a number of times if you've been in this congregation for a while. I always tell the story of how I saw a blackbird, a Eurasian blackbird, the one with the orange beak and the little squeaks that they make, basically go and find one of those yellow straps that goes around boxes to reinforce boxes. And they brought it back to their nest, which was in a drain pipe. So they were going deep inside the drain pipe to build their nest, brought it back to the nest, and were trying to break the strap down to use it for the nest. And as a result of that, they had it in their mouth and they're banging their beak against the concrete, and they were grabbing it with their foot and pulling it with their beak, and they couldn't break it. So eventually there was a point in time where I observed this long yellow strip hanging out of the drain pipe. The bird had eventually given up and just taken it in and made it part of the nest, even though that she couldn't break it down or he couldn't break it down. The point behind this is that they did not know shear stress. They didn't know that it has to be sheared in order to be cut. But a human will come along and they will find some sort of object to cut that strap off of their box when they receive a package. In fact, I've seen people get pretty creative with that process. And there's been various ways in which they have removed that strap. Box cutter, scissors, a key, right? Your teeth. Maybe you actually try to peel back the fused plastic. Imagination. So those four things make you very different from everything else. But what does not make you different from everything else is your ego. And so the reason why this is very, very, very important is that the ego is going to operate off of frames of references in order to process information, to self-preserve, connect, and reproduce. What does that mean? That means that your ego controls the boundary or limit size of your capacity to self-preserve, to connect or be in relationships, and to reproduce. And as a result of that, we need to factor in the programming that is present in frames of reference. An example of a frame of reference is, as I've said before, color, right? So for example, let's say that we have a pink house. We have a pink hairbrush. We have a pink My Little Pony. Whenever pink is present, there is a pleasant experience attached to it. Now we have a black bedspread, a black lamp, maybe even a black doorknob. Every time black is present, there is a moment in which there is a adverse feeling, a discomfort concerning black. Why? Because the person's favorite color is pink, not black, and black is their least favorite color. And so there's a contrast there. There's frames of reference. So every time we encounter something pink, we experience comfort. We experience contentment. It sits well with us. We see this pink curtain set, and it just makes sense that it would have to be in the house. Another person comes along and sees the pink curtains and goes, oh my God, that's so ugly. Because their favorite color is blue. And so they look at a blue thing and they say, that's nice. They look at a pink thing and they go, oh my God, that is so gaudy. That is an example of a frame of reference. The reason why this is important is because what we're covering tonight and what we're getting into tonight is our first problem. The first change that needs to occur is a healing of wounds. And I'm going to explain to you that those wounds don't always equate to huge traumatic experiences. They don't. They can be very simple. There can be a wound because you sought validation at a moment when something else was going on. And I'm going to give you an example of this from my own life as far as wounds go. Okay. So everybody who has been in kindergarten has had the opportunity to glue macaroni to a paper plate, make designs, and then the teacher put spray paint or acrylic paint on the paper plate, or maybe you're allowed to paint the paper plate. But the point is that everybody's had that opportunity. If you've gone to public school or whatever, most likely you have experienced that. Some who have not, but majority of the people. I mean, when in my first marriage, my kids came home with macaroni plates from school. So I had created a macaroni plate and I was pretty proud of it. I was in kindergarten. And there is a principle of an ideal that you want to present that to your family for approval, right? So the principle is you're a kid and you go and you write a long letter, or you write something on a picture, you draw a picture, you color it, you do all kinds of stuff to it. Why? Because it is a self-expression. It's an expression of your what? Imagination. Okay. And in that process, there is a need in human existence for a validation that that is a pleasing or acceptable expression. Okay. And so basically, short version is that as I was getting ready to present this macaroni plate to my mother, a crisis of epic proportions occurred. And I never got to present that macaroni plate. And what's interesting about it is it did something inside of me to create two things. Number one, it taught me, inappropriately, it taught me that I was not validated in my self-expression, which meant what? That I should not express myself. That wound carried weight throughout my childhood to where I would create things and they would have some flaw in them, no matter how hard I tried. And I'm not saying that I was a perfectionist with it. What I'm saying is I would always conclude, oh, it's okay that it cracked, or it's okay that the paint ran because I did the best I could. But the truth is that the reason why that project was never full is because there's a moment when I needed that validation. I did not get it, and it became a wound. Was it my mom's fault? Nope. She didn't do anything wrong. Was it my fault? Nope. I didn't do anything wrong, but it created a wound. And that wound carried. And I'm not entirely sure that I've even yet all the way healed from it. But that wound carried in such a way that I, A, developed a limiting belief that I cannot make good things. right? That I cannot create things that don't have a defect in them. And B, also that I am not free to express myself. There was a limitation placed on self-expression by that wound. I said, it was not my mom's fault because there was a crisis that occurred at that moment when I was going to present it, and it got kind of put on the back burner and never acknowledged again. And when I came in to the classroom a couple days later and it was still sitting on my desk, I just threw it away. So that's an example of wounds, right? It doesn't have to be this huge trauma. Okay, fine. Your car rolled and you got thrown through the windshield, and now you have some serious issues with driving. I get it. But I'm talking about simple things like needing to hear that you're good, needing to hear that you did a good job, right? And instead hearing you're never going to amount to anything, or hearing that you're not good enough. The reason why these wounds are so important is because not only do they create limiting beliefs, like what I said earlier, but also you need to also know that you will develop an identity based upon your wounds. How many people come along and they say, oh yeah, my dad, he drank a lot, and so, things weren't great in my childhood. And, so now I have to take medication because I have bipolar. You're right. And everything that you just said. Your dad drank a lot. And as a result of it, you were relatively or seriously victimized by it. And now you are coping with it through medication. But what's interesting is when I say, what is your diagnosis? You will say, I have PTSD. I have borderline personality disorder. I have multiple identity disorder. It has become a possession, and it has become a part of you. In fact, you'll say, I am bipolar. So now you're taking a human endowment and assigning a limitation to your life through that human endowment. Your sentience is identifying yourself as something that is actually a symptom. Every diagnosis that's present in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology, volume 3, 4, 5, whatever, all contain what are called traits. And when we do measurements, when we do psychometrics, we look for central tendency of traits. And if those traits are present in a greater amount than what we would call normal, then that's abnormal psychology, and that person receives a diagnosis. But all those traits are symptoms of something else. Psychology at large has included that that's symptoms of a disorder. The problem is that nowhere in there is there a function of change or healing. So basically, when I told you in the previous message, who told you were naked? Who told you were wounded? And what's key to that is, are you what you do, or are you who you are? And what you believe about who you are is what you do. A person who believes that they are bipolar, not that they have symptoms and a central tendency towards the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, will be bipolar. You say, "Oh, Rabbi Q, no, I know that I take medication, and it, when I'm not on it, oh my gosh, I go up and down, and man, I have these manic moments, and man, I have these depressive." Of course you do. You said you are bipolar. What you believe about yourself is going to tell you what to do. So your actions are actually the result of what you believe about yourself, not the other way around. Your actions don't make you who you are. Your symptoms of a disorder that may or may not be accurate. And when I say that, what I mean is there might be a wound that needs to be healed. And when it does, those symptoms won't be present anymore. Also, potentially, we're dealing with the function of reality where a person is told that they have something and they develop symptoms because they believe it. Okay. Oftentimes, people will seek help from counselors, and what they will encounter is information that will tell them what's wrong with them, and they will just become that identity. Last week, I made a statement where I said, you could stop watching right now if you'll just get this simple concept, right? Well, here's one of those. And I think I may have kind of stated it a little bit in the last session, but your identity is defined by others. You just have to figure out who you want to define you. Let me repeat that. Your identity is defined by others. Don't think for a second that your identity is defined by you. The reason I say that is because when others tell you that you are a thing, you will do those things. You will. So what you have to do is figure out who you want to listen to. So if you have a friend who on a regular basis is negative and has a bad attitude, and they on a regular basis call you the B word in jest or playing, or perhaps maybe a little bit serious because they believe a little bit in tough love or whatever their motivations are for projecting such filth upon you, if you're told it enough and you look up to them enough, you will become the B word. If your friend on a regular basis tells you that you are just an absolutely amazing human and that you have demonstrated on a regular basis how astounding it is to be around you, you will attain to greatness quickly because that person is telling you that your identity is a higher self. So obviously, deciding who to listen to is a little bit harder than you think, because the problem is that a lot of times we glean our information from our parents who we were given the expectation we could trust for information. But the truth is that a majority of the time, your raising is just a projection of their responses to their raising. In other words, what your parents were neglected in, you were probably neglected in. Because what they were trying to compensate for in their lives, they were not compensating for in yours. It's just that way. Now, again, this stuff is dynamic. This is not a static, concrete process that I'm discussing here. Now, the reasons why this is important is because basically, first of all, you need to figure out who you look up to or who you have an expectation of validation from. And then you need to figure out if that person is operating off of an authentic process of perception with you. Because if you're dealing with a human, what's involved? Their frames of reference. Their frames of reference. Which is why we look to something higher to define who we are. We look to the creator of the universe. We look to a higher power. We look to what we would like to call God, which is basically, in its short definition, something greater than you. Okay? If you're a Christian, which most of us are, you will be looking in Scripture for your identity. Well, there's two things you need to understand about that. First one is, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Which means what? Our righteousness is not based upon merit. I've often given the illustration of the sun, because the sun is kind of one of the constants in every human's life of heat, radiation, light, and of weather, right? And so a function of our lives is the sun. But can you actually do something in your actions to make the sun not shine? No, you cannot. There's nothing you can do to prevent the sun from shining. It will always shine. Even if there's cloud cover, there is a shining sun behind those clouds. Can you do something to diminish its power? No. Can you do something to add to it? Could you make the sun more intense, more dense, more radiation based, brighter light than what it already does? There's nothing you could do, right? There's no movement or action or statement that you could make that would change that. Why is that important? Because as of right now, in this reality and time and height, width, depth, we have what? Sunlight. Get over it. What's my point? My point is, you cannot add to, nor can you reduce the intensification of all power in the universe, your higher power, God, your creator. You can't. But you also cannot do anything to change what that says about you in Paul's writings or in the prophets or in Torah. You can't. You cannot change the fact that it says that you are a child of God. And in fact, there's an indication that God is very much a micromanager of your condition. Meaning what? He often maintains you in a good condition. Meaning what? You are a high maintenance child of God. If you choose to accept that definition as your core belief of who you are in your identity, then it does not matter what Joe Schmo thinks of you, or what this person over here thinks of you, or what they say about you, what they say about your symptoms, what they say about your diagnosis, what they say about what you do. What you do does not define who you are, but what you believe about yourself is exactly what you do. So if all of a sudden you're a child of God, what are you going to do? You're going to act like a God. Make no mistake, when we talk about being a child of God, we are not talking about that God is the progenitor of you. We are talking about your existence and identity. You don't go to a kitten and tell the kitten, well, you're just one great human. You cute little baby, you don't. You know that species is a kitten. And you're never going to identify that species as a human. But if you encounter a tiny human, say a toddler, and you look at them and say, oh, you're so cute, such a cute little baby. Why? Because that's the species, right? You identify that human baby as a human baby. So when it says we are children of God, it is not talking about because we were created. It is talking about what we are capable of, what species we are. And so if you're a high maintenance child of God, you are going to do things higher, above normal humanity, in the use of energy, in the use of authority, in the use of connection through collective consciousness. You see, when we start to get into the wounds being a definer of you, it gets scary. Because if your wound is the adult child of an alcoholic, most likely you yourself are going to follow in those footsteps because you have accepted the identity that that's what you are. When the truth is you're not an adult child of an alcoholic. That was an experience that you had, and there are learnings connected to that, but you're a high maintenance child of God. When we renew our mind, that actualization, that identity of self has to become such a concrete reality that you will not deviate because of others' opinion. If somebody has committed a crime, say theft, they're not a thief, but they believe they are a thief, or they would not have stolen. But if you call them a thief, you are creating a thief. That's kind of scary, because part of the renewing of our mind then becomes the responsibility of not misidentifying other people, not calling somebody a murderer, but instead that's someone who murdered. And see, the key to that identity is remembering what you will do if you believe something about yourself. So the next time you're doing an action that you think is probably something you don't want to do, Paul said, I do the things that I don't want to do. That's what I end up doing. Now he's just a little bit off, because the truth is when we don't want to do something, we don't do it. And when we do, we work hard to do it. But what he was saying is that in his heart, he has a desire to serve God. He loves God. But when the temptation to sin against Torah would come, it would entice him and draw his heart away from his relationship with God. But I promise you, if he didn't want to do the sin, he wouldn't do it. I promise you that. And so as a result of that, what we have is an idea that people will be carrying out actions, be labeled as that thing, and it will create a perpetual cycle. One of the more difficult places that wounds play a role in identity is in abuse trauma. People don't realize this, but abuse trauma, whether it be physical, whether it be a violation of reproduction, whether it be something along the lines of mental, like, almost like a gaslighting or manipulation, whatever the abuse is, it has a tendency to create identities. Because abuse usually makes a person think something about themselves that is not true. If it's in the area of violation of natural order processes when it comes to reproduction, a person will develop identities based upon those unnatural occurrences. And when I say abuse, what I mean is when someone is either forced, coerced, or manipulated into preserving someone else, connecting with someone else, or reproducing with someone else. That's usually how all that occurs. So there are people who will force people to be connected with them. They will intimidate them into being their friend. That happens a lot in high school and in the higher grades, not as much in the lower grades. But as teenagers begin to suffer the crisis that Erikson called the role confusion versus identity crisis, yeah, they have a tendency to move in the direction of intimidating somebody into being their friend, somebody who's unhealthy in their mind. Okay, so when we're dealing with abuse, a lot of times the identity is not good. What people don't realize is if that identity is accepted, however messed up the relationship between the person who had the authority and the person who did not have the authority was, the person who did not have the authority looked to the other person for their identity knowledge. And that identity knowledge then became their behavior. Do you see the problem here? So when we are dealing with the function of abuse in identity, it is imperative to heal that identity. But here's the problem. Remember the red versus the blue, or the pink versus the black? All emotions attached to the contextual sensitivity of a memory, or what we would call a trigger, are attached to that specific category. So a person may look like the person who abused them, or the person may smell like the person who abused them, or maybe some other thing triggers. I had just the other day a trigger as we drove past a certain establishment. We were just driving, we drove past a certain establishment, and that triggered a a nausea and discomfort, an uneasiness where if I couldn't sit still because that establishment is attached to an abusive relationship. And so it triggered. That's an example of that establishment didn't do anything to me, but it triggered a memory of abuse. And so as a result of that, then I found myself having to process it. Couldn't figure out why it was triggered. And then over time, I began to really kind of put things together and was like, oh, okay. But I had to return to my identity. I had to step back into child of God. Who told you you were naked? Remember, that's what Yahweh asked Adam in the garden when he says, oh, I was naked and I heard you in the garden and I was naked, so I hid myself. And he says, who told you you were naked? Who gave you that identity? Where did that identity come from? Right? Okay. So when we are working with the renewing of the mind, we are going to have to explore what wounds have done to our identity. So then the question arises, how do you heal from a wound? And although there are techniques present in things like timeline therapy or neurolinguistic programming or EMDR therapy, those are really kind of the only ones that deal with the subconscious. There's plenty of psychotherapy out there. You want to talk about, and most likely over and over, because you're probably going to therapist hop. You want to talk about your owies. You want to talk about what somebody did to you. You want to talk about the pain that you're experiencing. There is a plethora, and you can pay upwards of $500. But at the core is the trigger. You need to remove the ability for that trigger. And I'm going to share with you some simple affirmations that you can get your mind wrapped around when it comes to triggers. The first one is that you should you should invariably be repeating to yourself on a regular basis, I am not what I do, but what I believe about who I am is what I will do. And in that process, you can say, I'm a high maintenance child of God. Therefore, I am going to be a child of God. Therefore, I'm going to do child of God things. Okay. But in that process, that's not always enough because you have to believe it, which means what? You have to have proven it to the same part of you that has proven to you that you're a piece of crap, that you're an alcoholic, that you're a schizophrenic, that you're bipolar, that you're this or that you are that. When we attach any adjective to that label, if we say, I am a good high maintenance child of God, that's wrong. That's not what it says. It doesn't say we're good. In fact, I can give you a number of scriptures that says no one is good, not one. But let's say that we accept that an adjective proves that you are operating in a false identity. Let me give you an example. I am a horrible mother. The adjective horrible proves that it is a false identity. I am a good man. That is a false identity. Why? Because what happens when you do bad? are you still going to believe that identity? And one could argue, if we go with the circular argument here, you believed something where you believed you were bad because you're doing what's bad, right? So there was doubt instilled or whatever. You're a child of God. It doesn't say you're good. It doesn't say you're bad. It says you're a child of God. Why? Because we have proven tonight through various discussion that you are different from an animal and that your ego has a tendency to assert those animal instincts as priority. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? There are times when you need to preserve self, or you need to keep yourself alive. You are in a situation where you actually have to make sure that you stay alive. You need connectivity. However much humans like to be independent, they still need validation from other humans. In fact, it's interesting because even the hermits that go off by themselves and build a cabin in the woods or whatever, they're actually having an opinion about themselves based upon other information from other people, albeit it's the lack of other people, but it's still other people. And then, of course, reproduction is a given. I really don't need to discuss that at length, do I? Every single adult human being present has experienced that function of reality. But what makes you superior is the self. And what makes you superior is your sense, a built-in sense of what is good behavior and what is bad behavior, and the ability to process that information beforehand. So in the process of healing from your wounds, one of the things that you need to do is stop believing the identities. Now, like I said, there's a lot of other ways to remove the triggers. But if a trigger occurs, one of the things that you can do is identify who you are. And remind yourself that you are not that thing. Because I will bet you that whoever exploited you, whoever abused you, or whoever wounded you, most likely had an attitude and told you, used words to tell you who you were in those situations. Right? So as a result of that, what we have then is we have a trigger occurring and you immediately countering with, this is who I am. Because you either believe the Bible or you don't. And if you believe the Bible, then Romans chapter 8 says you're a child of God. And if you're a child of God, you are not a kitten. You're a child of God. And if you're a child of God, that means you will do child of God things. But you have to believe that. Okay. Second thing you can do if you trigger is ground and help yourself understand that you're not present in abuse right now. Ooh, this is a hard one. This is a very difficult one. It's hard to do this one because basically what you have to do is convince yourself that you're in the present. And the first thing that you're going to do when you trigger in any wound is you're going to disassociate and feel like you are back in the moment of the wound. Now, in that sense, then when you ground, what you have to do is convince yourself that that trigger is lying to you. So when a wound occurs, or when a wound trigger occurs, you need to realize you're not being wounded again. Okay? Now, if you are actually being wounded again, that's a very different story, right? You're doing more than triggering at that moment, I promise you. Because we do definitely have to get into the idea of that you can get trapped in an identity and you will attract the same problem again. you will attract that wound again because you believe the identity about that wound. So that's the second thing, is to understand that the trigger is happening now, but the wound is not happening now. And therefore, if you focus and you're able to center yourself, ground yourself into the now, then that wound will not have the intensity that it would have if you believed that the wound was happening again. You're experiencing the pain all over again. Nope, sorry, that happened 10 years ago. I'm here and now. And now you add in, I'm a high maintenance child of God. I don't do those things. I don't attract those kind of people. I attract other high maintenance children of God. You see? The third thing that you can do with a wound is you can offer empathy to the fact that you yourself have most likely wounded others. And if you yourself need reconciliation, if you yourself need a second chance, if you yourself need an opportunity to continue in life without that being the stigma of your existence, then surely you can grant that to the person or to the situation in which you were wounded. What is that? That's empathy for the other high maintenance child of God who was given a bad identity and did actions that they believed that they were. You say, that sounds like forgiveness. Exactly. If there was any other way to understand forgiveness in its psychological sense, it would be to allow for the mercy that you desire. So in a weird sort of way, even though that there is proof that when it says, if you do not forgive others, your Father in heaven will not forgive you, is a gloss. When it says, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who trespass against us, that's the principle. The principle or the idea here is, if you want another chance, if you want reconciliation, if you want to be redeemed from the things that you've done wrong, then you allow for that to be a possibility in the existence of the people who caused the wounds. Fair enough? Did I say this was going to be easy? No. This is what's going to happen. You're going to trigger off of a wound. Limiting beliefs are going to play, right? You're going to react, most likely in fight or flight. So it's going to probably be the same exact look as anger, okay? Because that's what? Adrenaline, endorphins, right? It activating your quick twitch muscles and heightening the glucose in your brain, right? For reactivity. That's anger, right? Those are the same things that are present in anger that are present in fear. So when the wound trigger occurs already, you're, heightened sense of everything, maybe even a little bit of paranoia, etc. The wound causes you uneasiness, emotional distress, etc. I promise you, the last thing on your mind is going to be high maintenance child of God. The last thing on your mind is going to be, that's not what's happening right now. The last thing on your mind is not going to be, well, since I probably need to have some grace concerning my wounds, then they probably do too. Those are the last things going to be on your mind. In fact, what you're going to do is you're going to catch yourself later on. You're going to say, man, That is exactly what Q was talking about. That was a trigger. And I screwed way up. And I never did the identity thing. And I never did the, I don't even remember. What did he say I was supposed to do? Some grounding or whatever. That's what it's going to be. Okay. When we talk about renewing of the mind, we need to understand that this is going to be a area where we become a conscious observer and where we put a gap between stimulus and response over time. Now, neurolinguistic programming and all of its nuances will absolutely remove a trigger from a wound. But what I'm saying is, in the meantime, while you are still learning or trying to decide whether that's an avenue which you want to pursue, which I myself have experienced severe trauma when I was a kid on all the abuses, went through EMDR therapy and had the triggers removed at the subconscious level from the wounds, and therefore they don't have the power that they had before. Are there lapses in that? Absolutely, because there's still one function, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But the principle is that you need a form of therapy that removes triggers from memories. Now, I'm going to factor in something. When I say, okay, so when I say wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlement, lack of imagination, I'm not saying and a lack of imagination after entitlement. A lack of imagination is present in all three of those categories. So what's the lack of imagination concerning the wound? Well, it's simple. You are operating off of memory. Memory. The memory of the wound. That's it. That's all that's present. That's all that's left. The person who did those things to you is probably, unless it's an ongoing thing right now, which means you probably need to seek help or you need to move in a direction of separation from that person, whether it be a friend, a family member, whatever. You need to get that toxicity out of your life. You need to get that abuse or those wounding moments away from you. Okay. And that in and of itself is also dynamic because obviously there is the potential for a person to change while you are present with them in that process, but most likely not. Most likely you probably need to get out of that situation. But here's the key. It's just memories. That's it. That's all it is. It's a whole slew of memories. And you are literally living your life in the past. You are living your life letting every little damage that occurred dictate what your life is going to be. And because you believe those identities, you are going to do those things, which means what? You're going to attract that same mess again. You're going to attract that same mess again. Coworkers, friends, family, you're going to attract it again. Okay? You're going to draw it to yourself through little nuances of limitation in your operation because you're not operating in your imagination. So here's your imagination, and here's one of the biggest tools for triggers. Do I want in the future to look this way, to feel this way, to experience these things this way? If the answer is yes, then you should probably just turn off the video. But if the answer is no, then you need to use your imagination to create a self that does not react to those triggers. And finally, we arrive at one of the last things, and this is difficult. Number one, remember last week when we talked about shifting gears, car, all those type of things, or in the last session rather, we talked about that the brain is lazy. If the brain is lazy, then this is how you need to think about this. It is going to be an absolute uphill battle with your brain to heal from a wound. Do you know why? Because the emotional attachment to the learnings. That's it. Picture this, if you will. You are getting on a bike with training wheels. It's your first time trying to ride a bike. You're leaning to one side or the other, and you're all rickety with the handles as you're trying to pedal, right? And it's bouncing from one wheel to the other wheel. And there's this moment when you're up on two wheels and the training wheels no longer are present. And there's that moment where you're actually riding the bike. And there's that moment where you're achieving that. Now your mind is emotionally attached to the achievement, meaning the memory of riding the bike now has a reward hormone attached to it. So every time you get on the bike and ride it, you are experiencing that moment again. It's a trigger. Riding your bike is a trigger from the first experience you had with the bike. Welcome to wounds. Riding the bike is a trigger to experience the emotions that are attached to the learnings of riding a bike. A wound is as simple as that. There was a first time that it occurred, and when that moment happened and that first time occurred, there was an experience at that time of emotional attachment to the learnings, and that emotional attachment then now becomes what? A learned experience, but the emotions that are attached to that were the way in which you coped with it, which means your brain thinks that it works. Your brain has a frame of reference that the way in which it reacted to the wound is the right way. Enter ego, right? Your brain thinks that the best way to deal with this wound is the way you've been dealing with it. Here's the problem. If you still have the wound and you still have the trigger, then that's not true. Because that wound is creating a false identity, right? That wound is creating a false identity. And that false identity then is carrying over into a belief about who you are that's technically an accusation towards God. That he made junk. God don't make junk. He didn't make junk. And you're accusing him of making junk if you decide that you want to stay in your wound. I'll give you an example. There are multiple times that I will be talking with somebody, say, in the comment section, say of YouTube or something like that, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, you know, I have a phobia of heights," and I'll say, "Could fix that," and they're like, "Oh yeah," and I'll say, "Yeah," and they'll say, "How?" I'll say, "Oh well, in NLP, right? I'll do a phobia script," and they will backpedal. Oh well, you know, I don't really know anything about that, and you know, I guess I'm not really that afraid of heights. Your brain at that moment is your enemy, your adversary. In the Hebrew, Hasatan. Transliteration, Satan. Your brain at that moment is Satan working against you to keep you from healing. My point is that your brain thinks that the way in which it dealt with the wound works. So why change? And in that process, it will backpedal. It will try to prevent you from changing the mechanism that's already in place. It would be like you trying to ride a bike differently. Your brain will not let you do it. Let's say that you want to sit on the handlebars and pedal the pedals. So basically, you'd be riding backwards. Your brain is not going to let you do that. You could probably learn how to do that. And I'm sure there's people who do tricks who do that. But my point is, your brain's not going to just let you hop on a bike and ride on the handlebars and pedal. It's not. But it will absolutely let you hop on a bike, push off, pedal away, and you're done. Because immediately it's going to trigger that emotional attachment to the learning. And that learning, that learned behavior, is rewarded by a conditioning of endorphins, whatever the reward chemicals are that are operating at that moment. So what's the three important things that we learned tonight? Number one, that you're not going to want to heal from your wounds because your brain's already dealt with it. And your ego thinks that that's sufficient. Okay. It's going to require you to suppress your ego. Number two, unless you remove the intensity of the trigger, you are going to have to deal with the intensity of the emotion. And you're going to have to do that through a restructuring. You're going to have to think to yourself that you are something different than what that is saying you are. And not only that, but you are going to have to convince yourself that it's not happening at this moment. It's not occurring right now. Okay? When you are dealing with identity, you need to decide if the information being provided you about your identity is legit. Listen, one of the things that I can say about the creator of the universe is there's really not anything higher than him. And so if that's the case, so we'll just go to the very origin of all creation, of all things of all time, there's nothing higher, which makes them an ultimate authority on identity. And if you are somebody who accepts the Bible as is, then we can say Romans chapter 8 says you're a child of God, if indeed you are in Christ. And so as a result of that, then we can understand that if someone calls you the B word, or someone calls you the A word, or something like that, then you can easily go, I'm a high maintenance child of God, I'm good. You're not even remotely registering with me. Go away. Kick rocks. Because literally that identity is intact, believed, and practiced. A high maintenance child of God will do God things. Just like a human child will do human things, and a kitty will do kitty things, and a puppy will do puppy things. A puppy will never do human things. Therefore, a child of God doesn't do human things. A child of God does God things. That is your species. That is your identity. That is your function, right? What you believe about yourself is what you will do. That is your function. Okay, so to wrap things up, when we are dealing with the healing of wounds, we need to understand that the first time when it occurred created a whole mess of that category. And every time there's a context present, there's a trigger. That trigger will rise up and it will create what? The scenario of feeling like you are in it again. Your brain will disassociate from the reality of what you see, hear, feel, touch, smell, right? And in that process will tell you to see, hear, feel, touch, and smell what it wants you to. And in that moment, you will not be a functional human being. You will be a dysfunctional human being. And in that moment, you can very possibly create wounds yourself, but also you are perpetuating the problem. So that whole category needs to change, right? But then also there's a principle that it worked. The solution to the cognitive dissonance that occurred during the wound worked. If it didn't work, then you wouldn't do it. It worked. And since it worked, your brain has no interest in changing it, which means you will receive resistance from your own psyche on healing from a wound, on healing, period. Okay. And then on top of all that, you will unfortunately believe the identity that the wound carried to begin with, and therefore you will do what the identity says you are. And that means you will wound others. And that means that you will perpetuate the process. If you want to be the change that this world needs, you need to learn how to adjust in the wounds. Remember that empathy for yourself, or an expectation, or maybe even an entitlement of empathy for yourself, that you should be redeemed, that you should be given a second chance, that you should be forgiven, that you need reconciliation for whatever wound you may have caused somebody in the past. Expect that same treatment for the person who caused the wound in you, however traumatic it was. However traumatic it was. It is not wrong for somebody to change, but it is very wrong to expect somebody to continue to have an identity that doesn't allow them to change and forces them into a state of existence by which they are going to perpetuate what they did to you. I know this is not easy. This is not puppies and kittens. This is not a rose garden. This is not anything pleasant. But I promise you, when you are done with the wound, you will become a healer of the wound. Because your brain will have learned how to heal, it will teach others. It will say, you know, I don't know how to explain this to you, but what you're doing doesn't work. I know that your brain thinks it works, but I'm going to prove to you that it doesn't, because I'm going to tell you my story. And you're going to tell them exactly how it happened, how when you healed from your wound, all of a sudden your life changed, and they're going to hear it. And perhaps maybe they don't have to suffer in it as long as you did. Whatever wound you heal from, you will become a healer of that wound. That's the change that this world needs, is experts in the wounds, experts in healing the wounds. That's the change that this world needs. Remember, what's the world doing right now? They're going, you know what? I would change if this person would change. I cannot believe that he continues to do this and expects me to change, right? I would change if this person would change. Oh, by the way, it's his fault anyways, or it's her fault anyways, that all this happened, right? And then what? The whole time that That person's saying that. This person who's next to him is saying, oh no, it's his fault or it's her fault. And I will change when they change. So who's going to change? Both people are saying, I'll change when they change. Is anybody going to change? No. The moment that you stop saying, I will change when they change, you have become the change that this world needs, because you will have stopped believing the lie that it's everybody else's fault. I promise you, you have created wounds in this world that you need to be reconciled to, that you need a clear conscience about, that you need to help people heal from. But I'm going to tell you this. Until you heal from that wound, you cannot heal. Okay? So in that sense, when you're becoming the change that this world needs, that means that you have healed. It's when the moment when you decide to be the change. The moment you say, okay, yeah, I know I was saying that when that person changes, I'll change. And they're saying when I change that they'll change. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to change because they promised that they would change if I changed. So I'm going to change. And lo and behold, all of a sudden you are changing and you are creating change. Because why? Because the other people said, when he changes, I'll change, right? You are creating the change. You are now becoming the change that this world needs. The second part of that is this idea that it's everybody else's fault. The moment you start to realize that you have left a swath of destruction because of your reactions to your wounds and because of your constant perpetuation of limiting beliefs and therefore limitations upon your life, and because of your entitlements in which you have exploited others and never used your imagination to picture or believe yourself to be something other than what you are right now. I am who I am. Hogwash. Oh, well, that's just how I am. No, it's not. Because if it was, then it wouldn't say that you're this other thing. And if that's just how you are, then Christ would not have come and said, hey, you need to change your behavior. You need to think differently. You need to speak differently. You need to act differently. But one of the key things that he said was, for example, he says, if you're praying for a thing, believed that you have received it. Well, you know what? Okay, just for a moment, we're going to get into this thought process real quick. Simple. BS. You cannot believe something into existence. You have to demonstrate that you want it. That's number one, right? Which a lot of us don't realize that we don't necessarily want it. Okay? You have to what also? You have to imagine yourself being it, receiving it. This is not believe as in, oh, Christ is going to do it and I'm convinced of it. And you're trying to tell yourself that the whole time, when really, if you need to tell yourself, you're lying to yourself. Imagine yourself in it. Because once you stop using your frames of reference to create your future and start living in your imagination about your future, of who you want to be, not who you're afraid that you're going to be, but who you want to be, is when you will start acting that way. And you will invite things into your life that before you limited yourself in believing that that could ever come into your life. Not to mention when we get into sabotage, which is a whole nother subject, but we're not going to do that tonight. Okay, so short version of this is you need to heal from your wounds. Problem is that your wounds think that they're fine. And you think that your current way of dealing with your wounds, whatever that may be, is fine. And furthermore, you're spending your days telling people you are this thing. I'm bipolar. I am alcoholic. Every single time you say that, you're going to be it. And then you're going to have to use willpower to keep from doing it. Or you're going to do it. One of the two. And eventually your willpower is going to run out. Once you run out of strength, once you start to step into entitlements, you're not going to care whether you do it or not. Okay? All right. So that is basically everything concerning wounds as something that's wrong or dysfunctional in your life. Wounds are a dysfunction of the true self. Wounds are a dysfunction of the true identity. Wounds are a dysfunction of an effective human being, an effective lifestyle. It's very difficult to heal from wounds. I haven't healed from all of mine, but I'm at least going to try to teach you how to heal from yours. So I will say shalom, and we will go ahead and in this. I know that last week I gave opportunity for comments and things like that, but I'm just going to let people write comments in the YouTube channel, and I will respond to those comments because something's wrong with the live chat. I haven't figured out how that works yet. I need to watch some YouTube videos to figure out how to do that correctly. But in the meantime, for those of you who are on Zoom after this session, after this time period, I'm going to open up the potential for discussion there. If I could do the live chat on the live stream on YouTube, I would, but I can't. I think we'll go ahead and leave the live stream going. If people in my Zoom call want to ask questions, and we'll go from there. So does anybody who's in the Zoom call want to unmute and ask a question or make a comment? Remember, your input is very, very welcome, and I really want to hear from you, whether it be in the comments on YouTube or whether it be you guys here in Zoom. So does anybody have anything? Any questions, any statements? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream. Like I said, if you're on YouTube and you have a question, post it in the comments. I'll respond to the comments. I'll check back on this video and see if there's anything I need to answer or talk to you guys about. And if not, if something's malfunctioning or whatever, let me know through your channel of communication with me, and I will try to get that fixed. So for those of you who are on YouTube, we'll say shalom. You have a good night. Heal from your wounds.